Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, Jeremy and Tim, it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to our today's event on behalf of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, the impact of AI on local model news. I think an issue which is now not only in the US but also in Europe, everywhere, and I was very happy to hear that, especially now in our office, together with the Medill School of Journalism, we had the pleasure to implement this project. It started end of last year. It was accompanied by a workshop in November, which took place here in our office. And I'm really delighted to be able now, due to the fact that my colleague Paul left, and I'm now able to present this study together with you. So it's a great pleasure to have you all here.
Thank you.
And to get some of the news which were conducted by these interviews with experts all over the world, and to listen what are the challenges and what are probably also the dangerous sides of AI when we talk about the impact of AI on local journalism in particular. So without further ado, I hand over to you because you are going to moderate, and Sabine was also our program manager who accompanied the project and who accompanied also this fruitful cooperation with Medill School. And once again, therefore, great thanks from my part. So Sabine, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. So as we just heard, we had last November a workshop here in our office in cooperation with the Medill School from Northwestern University. We had about more than 20 experts coming together, and we tried to dig deep into what does AI really mean for local journalism. And we all know that the local news business model has collapsed over the last several years. And we were wondering, AI will present new challenges, definitely, but also maybe there are some solutions along the way. So with this, I give over to Jeremy Gilbert and Tim Franklin, and with the question, really, what did you take out of this workshop and also the subsequent interviews with experts all over the world?
Sure. Thank you, Sabina, for the question, and thank you so much to Konrad-Adenauer for collaborating with us on this work and for being a partner with us on this work. And I want to thank all of you for being here this evening and taking the time to come and to discuss this report, which we've been working on. Sabina called, I think it was last fall, with this idea about taking a look at the implications of AI on local news. And this was one of those ideas where we just immediately seized on it. This is, I think, one of the major issues in American journalism today, and that news organizations are all wrestling with. And so the goal was to interview as many experts around the world as we could. We had the workshop, as Sabina mentioned, and then after that, Jeremy and I interviewed a number of experts around the globe in media and technology and in academia and in philanthropy to get their views about what the impact of AI was going to be on local news. And of course, those views ran the gamut from being an incredible opportunity for local news to being an existential threat to local news. The one thing that everybody agreed on was this is going to have a profound impact on the future of news in America. So we're going to talk about that tonight. We'd love to get your questions and your feedback on the report this evening, and we're really grateful to you for being here. So we ended up producing a 61-page report. I think there are copies of it that are floating around. It's also posted on the Foundation's website, as well as on the Medill Local News Initiative website, so you can download the PDF version and read it there. You'll be happy to know that we're not going to recite all 61 pages this evening. We're just going to give you some top line findings from the experts here this evening. So, Jeremy, is there anything I forgot that you wanted to mention before we dive in?
No, the only thing we have to acknowledge is that even over the period of the report, the technologies have changed pretty radically, and that you will hear about recommendations, some of which may feel like they also need to evolve a little bit as we go. And so we have to recognize that the challenges for news media, but also the opportunities, are changing as quickly as the technology is. And so we will try to guide you through both what we learned and also what we think you might want to think about, but knowing that this is a moment of extreme innovation, which presents lots of opportunities, but also challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. So we just have about 14, 15 slides. We're going to go through these very quickly, and then we'd love to get your questions, and we'll try to answer them to the best of our ability. So there we go. All right, so Jeremy, why don't you talk about opportunities from AI?
So one of the things we really wanted to focus on was not just the question of, can artificial intelligence replace news reporters or news editors or stand in for journalism? That was not only our point of view, but also our belief based on these conversations that that's not necessarily what we're talking about. Instead, we saw a set of opportunities that were about more than just productivity. So, for example, relatively few small local newsrooms have dedicated staff for customer service. So there are ways that smaller news organizations can potentially use generative AI tools like chatbots to help engage and interact with local consumers. There are good examples of this from places like Spotlight PA, which has an elections-based chatbot where they took all of their elections-based reporting and the chatbot answers only questions that it can find the answers in that reporting. So it's limited only to the set of facts that it knows. A second example is about the efficiency of news organizations. So some of this is about roles that probably don't exist. There is not in many local newsrooms as much editing as there once was. And generative AI radically improves systems that help with initially just spelling and grammar, now can pose more deep questions about the types of coverage and the type of writing that's engaged. And then also around personalization, one of the things that we heard a lot and that we know is that news consumers have expectations to be met where they are rather than learning what is sufficient to meet the news organization where it is. And we strongly believe that we're going to see more and more opportunities for news organizations who can personalize and customize the presentation of news. We think that this approach that enables news organizations to think about the reporting that they do as separate from the storytelling that they create is a good way to better serve their audiences. Instead of asking all audience members to consume the same content, we can offer these individualized kinds of content for journalism and journalism audiences. And then especially around the effective targeting of marketing and advertising. A lot of local newsrooms work with local advertising partners who are not as sophisticated, who are not necessarily bringing their own creative, for example, to the newsrooms. And generative AI can help both create the kinds of marketing materials that they need and also connect more effectively. And then especially the tools that free up journalists to do more original enterprise reporting, those tools are really important because there is so much data that can be directly told through automation that it would hopefully allow the human journalist to do things that only they can.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy, for that overview. So Jeremy's the positive person, and I'm the Dr. Doom of this duo. So I'm going to give you what we heard were the threats for AI and local news. The one thing, and we've documented it in our State of Local News project, it's been documented other places, the local news industry in the U.S. is in crisis. The business model has collapsed. So now we have the advent of this new technology, this incredible new technology, coming at a time when the industry itself is ailing and is trying to rediscover its own new business models. So this is yet another major disruptive force at a time when the industry is already grappling with disruption. The other thing, and I'm going to circle back to this second point in a minute because there was just news on this yesterday, but there's a great deal of concern that with generative AI, that it's further going to disrupt the business model and especially search traffic going back to local news organizations. And there are many who think this does pose an existential threat to a lot of local news organizations in terms of the traffic that they're going to lose because of generative AI. And as I say, we're going to get more into that in a minute. The other concern, which we heard a lot, is AI hallucinates. AI, if you will, lies. It makes stuff up. It gets stuff wrong. So there have already been some celebrated incidents of news organizations that have used AI and published AI stories that were just wholly inaccurate. And I think it's a lesson for the industry and a lesson for all of us, to be skeptical and to seek out multiple sources of information, but a lesson to the news industry that, look, this is still a relatively new, nascent technology, and it's in many ways not ready for prime time yet. It's going to get much better, but we can't rely on AI to replace humans when it comes to accuracy of news and information. The other really big concern is that this is going to replace human journalists, that this is going to eliminate jobs and journalism jobs. Right before I came over here this afternoon, there was a report that Gannett and its labor union are now having painful conversations about contract language in New York over use of AI in Gannett publications. So I think we're going to see more of that across the country as AI is incorporated more into the workflow. And the other thing is that this is coming at the industry quickly, and there need to be guidelines in place about its use. And my anecdotal concern is that there are a number of news organizations that have not gotten to this yet. They have not put these guidelines for how they're going to use AI in place. So right now, it's kind of helter-skelter. It's a little bit all over the place, how different news organizations are using AI. My hope is that everyone will at least have their own policies in place about when and how to use it. And then the other thing, and I'm going to get more into this in a second, is that many local news organizations are already financially strapped, so they don't have the time to implement some of these AI tools that could help them become more efficient. It's too overwhelming, and they don't have the capacity, either in capital or in humans, to implement some of these AI tools. So that's my Dr. Doom overview of AI. And then just quickly, and when we talk to experts, many of them hearkened back to the creation of the internet 25 or 30 years ago, and what that did to the local news industry, and we're still seeing the effects of that today. But many of them believe that this technology is going to be as disruptive or more disruptive than the creation of the internet itself. So we just wanted to, for the sake of context, put up on the screen what happened after the creation of the internet 25, 30 years ago. We've now seen the expansion of news deserts across the U.S. We've lost almost a third of all newspapers in the United States since 2005. We've lost about 2/3 of all of our local journalists in the U.S. During that same 18, 19-year time frame. And we've seen the growth of these news deserts, which not only leave, there are 203 entire counties in the U.S. with no source of local news, no newspaper, no public radio, no ethnic media, no digital-only outlet, nothing. And there are another 1,558 counties with only one remaining news source. So more than half of the counties in the United States either have no local news or only very limited access to local news. So we have this confluence of expanding news deserts. At the same time, we have the growth of AI, which can be used in nefarious ways to spread misinformation and disinformation. And my concern, especially in an election year, is that we could have an absolute wildfire of misinformation and disinformation, especially in these news desert, low information communities in the U.S.
And I think it is worth also noting, as we said, we're in such early days. It was only about 7 years ago that Google first introduced the idea of using transformer systems to take the outputs of large language models and start to make these generative AI technology that we recognize today. And really, most people weren't even exposed to the idea that generative AI was capable of having conversational interactions until 2022. And in the last 72 hours, both OpenAI and Google have announced dramatically improved models that enable things that even a year ago seemed impossible. So the pace of the technology is changing very, very rapidly. Its impact is still fairly unknown.
Yeah. And then, oh, yeah, go ahead, Jeremy.
And I think the other thing that is worth noting is that, and Tim is right, there are major challenges in terms of financial resources, in terms of human resources. There also is a big problem about awareness in a lot of newsrooms. That although the most recent Associated Press study on this said that 81% of newsrooms and 74% of news organizations are aware of AI. It means that a significant number of people are not even aware of generative AI. And even among the people who are, the level of experimentation, the level of knowledge about generative AI is fairly limited.
So we wanted to give you a flavor of some of the quotes that we heard from the experts that we spoke with over the months that we worked on this project. One was from Tom Rosenstiel, who has my all-time favorite title in journalism, which is he's the scholar of the future of journalism at the University of Maryland. Many of you probably know Tom. He was one of our participants, and he compared what's happening now to what happened with the creation of the internet, and noted that when the internet was created, many publishers across the U.S. First looked at it in terms of what can the return on investment be if I deploy this technology, rather than thinking long-term about how can I strategically use the internet to grow my business. And his concern, and he is very well plugged into what's happening, I think, across the country, is that we're seeing a repeat of the same movie from 25 or 30 years ago, where too many news executives are saying, what's the return on investment if I deploy AI, instead of what can I learn from AI and how can I use it strategically to improve our operation. And then we also talked to Doreen Mendoza, who now runs the AI adoption program with the American Journalism Project. And Doreen talked about this notion, which I mentioned, that local news organizations are in dire straits. They can't afford to invest in something like this that's constantly changing. So are they going to get left behind with the AI revolution? And how can they possibly continue to compete?
And I think we are cautiously optimistic that the report helps to identify a few things that local newsrooms could do that are affordable, that are in reach. There are certainly lots of tools out there that enable artificial intelligence, generative AI specifically, to act as an assistant for reporters, to help analyze data, to help create maps, to answer questions that propel reporting. There are free tools, there are low-cost tools, there are local tools that lots of newsrooms can use. Local meaning can be run on your own system, so you don't have to put your data in the cloud, which was another security privacy concern that we heard. La Nacion, for example, in South America, used OpenAI's technology to build a tool to enable their political reporters and editors to make their own graphics. The tool was so successful, they've actually licensed it as a software as a service tool, and it's actually another source of revenue for their newsroom. We also heard a lot about different ways that generative AI can help audience teams, both in terms of saving time, creating metadata or social posts, but also forging more personal connections, taking advantage of the first-party data that so many of these newsrooms have to give audience members what they actually want, rather than maybe what in the past we would have given them and told them that they should want.
And I meant to say at the top that one of the reasons that we wanted to do this report was so that we could get it out into the bloodstream of the industry, so that they could hear some of these messages from some of these experts and respond and adapt to what's happening with AI. And I think it was a goal of the foundation as well, was to really use this report as a tool to help prepare for what's coming with AI. So my hope is that this report helps to do that. On the business side, I think there's some clearer applications for AI that could be immediately helpful. For example, it could be incredibly helpful at identifying subscribers and potential members. You can see their reading habits. You can see how frequently they're visiting you. You can see the types of content they're reading, and then you can tailor messages to those folks. Also, the one great thing about this era we live in is that we have more reader data than we've ever had. So using AI to synthesize that reader data or listener data or viewer data can be powerful. It can be a powerful tool in understanding the behaviors of your news consumers. And then obviously in tailoring marketing messages to individuals instead of doing mass marketing is another potentially great advantage of AI. Optimizing content suggestions for potential subscribers or for members is also something that you can do with AI. And then cutting down on mundane, laborious tasks, whether it's HR, reviewing resumes, whether it's in accounting, whether it's in expense reports. A lot of the nuts and bolts kind of back-end office functions, we think and we're hearing may end up moving into the AI realm.
And another thing that we heard a lot about and has certainly been talked a lot about over this last week is the role that search traffic plays in helping news organizations find audiences for their journalism. And one thing that we have absolutely seen and heard is that social referrals and search traffic is down for most local news organizations. And there is great concern that the use of generative AI in search results will mean that there will be even fewer reasons for any individual news consumer to go direct to a news publisher. So the idea that Google might or has announced that it will add generative AI to its search results might mean for lots of local newsrooms, all that readers want out of the story appears in the search results itself, and there's no reason to go directly. So this presents a major, major threat to news organizations.
Yes. So one of the examples we heard was from the Philadelphia Inquirer, just to give you an idea of how this works. So AI gives you answers. So you put in a search query right now, and it'll give you a series of links and summaries, and then you click on the link, go to the news organization. With generative AI, you put in a search request, and it just gives you the answer. It eliminates that step in the process. So one example of the impact of traffic on this is the Philadelphia Inquirer every year reports on Groundhog Day and whether the groundhog sees its shadow. So people would do the search. Did the groundhog see its shadow or not? Then they would click through to the Inquirer website to get the answer. So this past year, as AI began to roll out, people posed that question, did the groundhog see its shadow? And they got the answer, and the Philadelphia Inquirer got no readers. Got almost no readers. Their traffic plummeted by 76% as a result of that. So that's just one example of one story at one publication of how this can happen. And our partners at Mather Economics, which is one of the leading news consulting companies in the country, they track social and search referrals, and already we're seeing huge drops in both. To news sites, and this trend is only going to continue. And so and we have the quote at the bottom. The deal was from Google and other platforms was, yes, we're taking your content that you're producing, and then we're putting it on our platforms, and then we're giving you traffic. We're sending you traffic that you can then monetize through programmatic ad revenue. But with AI, which just gives you the answer to the questions, it's completely changing that deal. It's completely changing that economic equation in what could be a pretty profound way. So that's something that we need to watch. And there's also been news on this front. Google announced just yesterday that it's going to fully deploy Gemini, which is one of its main AI engines that will be answering these questions, which means that right now, beginning this week, the traffic is only going to continue to decline, maybe in a pretty sharp way, from Google deploying this new search tool that you all will be seeing. And they say, well, we'll continue to have links at the bottom. People can click through. The concern is, by the news industry, is those won't be visible enough. And so this is, I think, we're going to start seeing an immediate impact from this.
And I think there are a couple of different ethical challenges that surfaced in the conversations we had. One certainly is that a lot of small newsrooms are struggling to say, how do we both set guidelines for use of artificial intelligence and do the experimentation that we need to understand what the value of this is? And one thing we heard over and over and over again is that newsrooms realize that their values to readers is not just informational, but is in the trust that the readers place in that information. And so they're very concerned about the misuse of artificial intelligence damaging that relationship with their audiences. So figuring out clear guidelines and standards for newsrooms their size with their resources is really important. A second thing is that many of the news organizations are very concerned about relying on these kinds of tools like ChatGPT or Google's models or models from Meta for publishable content. So in many cases, these larger news organizations are saying it is okay to do tasks that lead up to publication, but don't create something that is wholly synthetic and publish that. And then finally, there was a lot of sense in the conversations that we had that we need to have very strong transparency, especially transparency of something that could be confused as human output, whether it's voice content, whether it's imagery that is photorealistic or synthetic video, which seems to be very close to being common. So being transparent and disclosing to your audience when you use these tools is very important.
And there's not unanimity in the news industry about how to approach this era. On the one hand, news companies like the New York Times, like Alden, have decided to file suits against OpenAI and against Microsoft for copyright infringement, basically saying that you're taking our work product, you're posting it without attribution, some would argue even plagiarizing it, and then profiting off of it with no benefit back to us. So these two big media companies, the New York Times and Alden, have said, wait a minute, we're not going to stand for this. They filed major lawsuits against both companies, I think in the Southern District of New York. I would not be surprised if other media companies follow suit and also, so to speak, follow suit and file lawsuits against them. But others, like the Associated Press and others, have decided to collaborate.
And these licensing agreements take on a lot of different forms. Some people are licensing their back catalog. Some people are licensing their present content to turn up in query results. It very much depends. One of the challenges for smaller local news organizations is, do they have the right contacts and the right sort of heft to be able to strike beneficial deals? And what is a beneficial deal? The Associated Press was the first to sign. Are their terms as good as the last to sign? We don't know yet. There are also organizations like the American Journalism Project that have partnerships with the large tech companies, including, in AJP's case, OpenAI, to say, we will be the conduit to work with local news organizations. At this point, I don't think that there is a singular news organization or collective of news organizations that has a perspective that everyone should do this thing. So a lot of local newsrooms feel left to their own to try to either strike a deal or defend the content that they've already created, and it's still very unclear as to what the right approach is.
Yeah, and the bottom line is, as Frank Mungin, who's the Chief Innovation Officer at the Local Media Association, says, is the question is basically who owns content and who's going to be the owner of that content. And I think we may be on the precipice of what will be the mother of all copyright legal battles over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. I think this has all the makings of a, as we used to say back in the Midwest where I grew up, a real Donnybrook, a real barn burner, if you will. But this is going to be a fight of our times over who owns information. Do you want?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, and so we, at the end of the report, we have some recommendations. One thing, and this sounds so simplistic, but is obviously very difficult, is that we fervently believe, and all the experts we spoke to believe, that local newsrooms need to have AI strategies. It's not possible to just wait it out and see how things land. That from the very beginning, you have to have clear guidelines and policies which are part of that strategy, that you have to commit to experimentation. You don't necessarily have to publish it, but you can't afford to wait for other people to figure things out. And that you have to figure out at all levels of the news organization and in all tasks what kind of experiments would be most valuable. It's very difficult to both run a news site and to stay current on these technology changes, but we're at a point where people can't afford to do otherwise. That one of the things that we heard very clearly is that some of these business side projects are both very valuable and perhaps the first and safest area to do some of these experiments. Yeah. So can you figure out ways to serve your advertisers better? Can you find ways to improve the quality of your marketing? Can you find ways to offer more compelling reader revenue subscriptions? And that especially while you're doing that kind of experimentation, be very cautious that you don't damage the relationship and the trust that you have with your audience. So don't publish AI-generated news content without being absolutely sure that it is correct, that it is factual, and making sure that it's valuable. A lot of the mistakes that have happened so far, places where trust has been breached or companies have been found to be irresponsible, has everything to do with relying on generative AI to publish user-facing news stories or things that look like news. And then thinking about the value of your archival content. That archival content might be valuable because it could help train a large language model. It might be valuable because it could help a tech company understand what kinds of journalism you do. But it could also be valuable in that there might be interesting insights that can be surfaced using generative AI. And then finally, we have sort of a call to action that we really want and need local publishers to share what they learn. Not everyone is going to be able to do all of the experiments. Not everyone is going to have established the right guidelines. And the more that local news can work collectively, the more likely we are to benefit from rather than be harmed by generative AI.
Right. Thanks, Jeremy. And our hope with this report is that this will help speed that collaboration and that working together among those in the industry to both capitalize on AI as well as venture into it cautiously. So with that, thank you all very much. And Sabina, we'd be happy to try to answer any questions you have.
Yes. So now we'll turn it over to our audience here. Do you have any questions for Jeremy and Tim?
Question?
Yes.
My name is Medill with Justice Security, which is a website that publishes analysis of national and international security issues based in NYU law. And my background is in journalism, and I'm interested in hearing what you think on 2 points. One is, with local news organizations and news organizations, period, being so stretched as they are, how can they possibly properly experiment without getting into really dangerous territory for this? And the whole idea of fail fast was kind of problematic in the first place, but how can newsrooms learn enough fast enough about what would be accurate and principled use of this tool?
If I can just repeat the question real quick. So the question is, how can newsrooms that are stretched as they are and stressed, how can they have the resources to experiment?
You want me to go first?
Yeah, go ahead. I'll follow up. Yeah.
So I agree. It is a severe challenge. It's not going to be easy, but I think there are a couple of things that can happen. One, try to find some resources where you can stay current by observing what others are doing. So there are a number of organizations, including some at Northwestern, that are publishing about different things, different ways generative AI can benefit newsrooms. Some of it is sort of read the trade press, so to speak, read and stay current as much as possible. That's obviously imperfect by itself. A second thing is that I think, as we are seeing with almost everyone, it's important in your personal life to try to experiment with generative AI to see before you do anything that is sort of user-facing. I really do agree. I think it would be a mistake to say, AI is going to help me write a story, I'm going to experiment that way, rather than saying, AI can help me do something that leads eventually to the creation of journalism. So sort of saying generative AI can help me publish a story, probably very dangerous. Generative AI can help me transcribe some interviews or do some data analysis, probably much safer. So identifying some of those safer tasks that are happening anyway and trying to use generative AI with those would be my two recommendations.
Yeah, I would say experimentation and baby steps. So some baby steps that are being taken. I was at a conference recently. There's a broadcaster in Maryland, a TV station, that is using generative AI to produce the chyrons at the bottom of that you see at the bottom of the TV screens, and also some of the teases that you see at the top. They're not using it for teleprompter scripts yet. That may come at some point, but they wanted to experiment with these kind of small-scale steps first. So that's one thing. There's also a publisher in the Midwest that is experimenting with using generative AI for meeting covers. So the idea is you feed the minutes from the local city council meeting into the system. You ask it to write a 700-word story on what happened at the council meeting last night, and then it generates a story, and it generates a story in seconds from the minutes. But they're having journalists and editors go back and read that before it gets published, just to make sure it makes sense and that they've captured the essence of what happened. But those are kind of some small steps to start with. I think there's a lot of back-end experimentation that can be tried now. Like I was mentioning with HR, for example, or on the business side. Yeah.
Okay, we have another question over here.
So you briefly talked about hallucination and also about new developments in AI. And I was wondering, because in doing research with AI, you realize, it's not very useful because there's a lot of hallucination going on. Are there any steps, and I think that would probably also help journalism, to eliminate the hallucination AI produces?
I think one thing that is being overlooked now is that often we're only approaching some of these problems using generative AI as a solution, rather than relying on other forms of artificial intelligence. So we've had some success in my lab working on projects where we use generative AI almost as a translation layer. So a journalist asks a question that requires us to interrogate some data. The generative AI model helps frame the question in different ways, create queries, for example, in SQL, go and fetch the data, and then generative AI translates the results of the data back into something more conversational. So in that particular case, we're not actually relying on the generative AI to do searching where it has the risk of hallucination, but rather to frame queries and then describe, summarize the results we get back. I really do agree that there aren't enough safeguards yet. There are some techniques that seem promising around ways to put guidelines around generative AI models so you're more likely to get back responsible responses. But right now, we're still at a place where I, for example, wouldn't trust a generative AI chatbot as a research assistant because it's so likely to turn back either false results or to miss something that we need to know.
And by the way, the lab that Jeremy referenced is the Knight Lab, which is housed at Medill. And Jeremy is the Knight Chair for Digital Media Strategy at Medill. And so there's a lot of experimentation that Jeremy and others are doing with AI in the Knight Lab. So just wanted to provide that background.
Is there another question? Yes?
I'm curious, because you're training the next generation of journalists, like how much guidelines you've set at Medill, if you're coordinating this with other journalism schools, and how you're thinking about that at that level.
So we do have guidelines at Medill about how, especially students, but in classes taught by faculty, we want to use generative AI. An interesting thing happened as we tried to establish these guidelines. So one of the things we did was a series of interviews with Medill students. And the Medill students said over and over again in different ways, we need to be told what we should be learning in class. We know that these tools will help us do things like generate writing from a collection of facts, which sounds a lot like news reporting. So one of the things that our guidelines are explicit about is that faculty members should be candid and clear. Do we want you to use generative AI? And if not, why? What is it you are supposed to learn that this model might also do? It is not unlike teaching arithmetic to younger children, where they're aware that there are an infinite number of calculators in the world, but they still need to know how and if the results of the calculator are correct. So for example, when we're teaching writing at Medill, we still want people to write by hand, at least in some parts of the process, so that later in the process, when they might use a generative model as part of their writing process, they know whether the outputs are good or bad. And so we're trying to be much more clear about when you could or should use these tools and when you shouldn't and why. We are also trying to be very clear about disclosure. So if you're using a generative model in a way that someone, a faculty member, for example, might not recognize that the outputs of your work came from a generative model, that you should disclose it. It's very different to say we used a generative AI tool to transcribe an audio interview than it is to say 3 of these 4 paragraphs were generated using ChatGPT. So what you use and how clearly you label it is important. And then finally, we are trying very hard to encourage all of our faculty to acknowledge that these students are going to go into a workplace where they may be asked to use generative AI. And so we would do them no favors by saying, we don't want you to use generative AI as part of our process. We need to find ways to incorporate it into the learning.
Yeah, that's a good answer. And on the issue of transparency with students, I think it's the same for professional journalists. If you're going to use it, fine, but disclose it. Be transparent about it. Tell the readers, tell the viewers that you're using it.
Okay, thank you so much to Jeremy Gilbert and Tim Franklin from Northwestern University, the Medill School of Journalism, for traveling here to Washington to be with us tonight. And thank you so much to all of you for spending the evening with us.
Thank you.